You rehearse conversations in your head before family dinners, strategically planning which version of yourself to bring, so you don't get the inevitable "you're being too intense" lecture from people who have no idea what you actually see. You catch yourself asking questions you already know the answers to, performing the slow discovery dance, so your partner doesn't feel completely transparent and exposed by how quickly you can read their psychology. You've become a master translator, automatically converting "your mother is manipulating you through guilt" into "I'm noticing some interesting dynamics in your family interactions. What do you think?" You leave social gatherings more exhausted than if you'd run a marathon, not from the people themselves, but from the crushing cognitive load of monitoring and editing every perception before it escapes your mouth. You find yourself apologizing for insights that turn out to be accurate, prefacing your perceptions with, "I might be wrong, but," when you know damn well you're not wrong. You've developed two completely different vocabularies: the rich, precise language of what you actually see, and a carefully sanitized version designed to keep others comfortable with their illusions. You realize you've been living as a psychological refugee in your own life, constantly adapting to environments that can't handle your natural way of being. And somewhere in the relentless performance of being normal, you make a terrifying discovery. You're not just living a double life anymore. You're slowly forgetting which version is actually you. If this exhausting psychological split sounds familiar, you're trapped in what Carl Jung documented as the most dangerous survival mechanism of the intuitive introvert. Not dangerous because it doesn't work, dangerous because it works too well. So well that it can completely erase your authentic self without you even realizing it's happening. In his 1957 interview with Dr. Richard Evans from the University of Houston, Jung revealed clinical observations from decades of working with this specific type. He documented patients who had become so skilled at psychological adaptation that they'd lost access to their genuine responses, their natural instincts, their authentic voice. But here's what part 1 of this series couldn't prepare you for about this psychological splitting. The exhaustion you feel isn't from your sensitivity. It's from what Jung called the compensatory mechanisms your psyche develops to hide your sensitivity. The loneliness isn't from being misunderstood. It's from being loved for a version of yourself that isn't real. The professional stagnation isn't from lack of ability. It's from working against your psychological grain every single day. Jung's compensation theory reveals that when you suppress your dominant intuitive function, your inferior sensation function begins operating unconsciously through chronic physical symptoms. Your relationships become built on false foundations. Your career becomes a performance of competence rather than an expression of genuine ability. And the most insidious part? The better you become at this adaptation, the more successful you appear from the outside, while internally you're experiencing what Jung observed as progressive disconnection from your authentic psychological core. Today, we're exploring Jung's actual clinical documentation of how this splitting develops, the specific psychological mechanisms that maintain it, the real costs it extracts over decades, and the integration methods he developed for patients who successfully learned to bridge their two worlds. Because Jung discovered something remarkable in his clinical practice, the individuals who learned to manage this split consciously, instead of unconsciously, didn't just survive their sensitivity. They became some of the most effective healers, leaders, and change agents he encountered. The goal isn't to eliminate the split between your inner perceptions and outer adaptation. It's to transform an unconscious survival mechanism into a conscious skill. Because the difference between thriving and barely surviving as an intuitive introvert isn't about learning to be yourself. It's about learning to be strategically, skillfully yourself without losing your sanity or your gifts in the process. To understand why you develop this double life, we need to examine what Jung observed during his 60 years of clinical practice with this specific psychological type. In his landmark 1957 interview with Dr. Richard Evans from the University of Houston, Jung made a crucial observation that explains the entire phenomenon. So you see, if the introverted intuitive would speak what he really perceives, then practically no one would understand it. He would be misunderstood. And so they learn to keep things to themselves. And you hardly ever hear them talking of these things. Notice three critical elements in Jung's observation. First, he doesn't say they choose to keep things to themselves. He says they learn to. This implies a conditioning process. Repeated experiences that teach them silence is safer than authenticity. Second, he doesn't say they're naturally secretive. He says they become secretive after repeatedly being misunderstood. This is reactive behavior, not inherent personality. Third, Jung observed that this learning process is so complete that you hardly ever hear them talking of these things. They don't just hide their perceptions from strangers. They stop expressing them entirely, even to themselves. But Jung went deeper. He observed that this creates what he called a great disadvantage, but an enormous advantage in another way. The disadvantage? You become emotionally cut off from authentic connection, even with people you love. The advantage? You develop an extraordinary ability to instantly read human psychology that becomes more refined precisely because you're forced to process it internally. For instance, they come into the presence of somebody they don't know, and suddenly they have inner images, and these images give them more or less complete information about the psychology of the partner. But Jung also warned about the cost of sharing these perceptions prematurely. But it, of course, can also happen that they come into the presence of somebody who they don't know at all, and they know an important piece out of the biography of that person, and are not aware of it, and tell the story, and then the hat is in the fire. This is where Jung's clinical observations become crucial. He noticed that this adaptive splitting doesn't happen in isolation. It triggers what he called compensatory mechanisms throughout the entire psychological system. When your dominant function is introverted intuition, your inferior function is extroverted sensation. This means your natural connection to physical reality, present moment awareness, and bodily experience is underdeveloped. Jung observed that the psyche cannot tolerate this imbalance indefinitely. In his clinical notes, he documented how the unconscious mind attempts to compensate through what he called the inferior function. What the introverted intuitive represses most of all is the sensation of the object, and this colors his whole unconscious. It gives rise to a compensatory extroverted sensation function of an archaic character. The unconscious personality can best be described as an extroverted sensation type of a rather low and primitive order. Instinctuality and intemperance are the hallmarks of this sensation, combined with an extraordinary dependence on sense-oppressions. Let's examine what Jung observed in his practice. This compensatory function manifests as primitive sensation-seeking, obsessive behaviors around physical activities, unexplained physical ailments, and chronic fatigue, overwhelming reactions to lights, sounds, textures, and crowds, and excessive dependence on external objects or people for grounding. Jung noted, this was the psyche's unconscious attempt to force connection to physical reality when the conscious mind had become too detached from the body and present moment. This explains why many intuitive introverts experience unexplained physical symptoms, chronic exhaustion, and overwhelming sensitivity to environments. Your unconscious mind is trying to balance your disconnect from physical reality, but it's doing so in unconscious, often disruptive ways. The exhaustion isn't just from social performance. It's from your entire psychological system working overtime to compensate for the split between your inner perceptual world and your outer adaptive behavior. Now let's explore how Jung's clinical observations manifest in your daily experience. He documented specific patterns that create and maintain the psychological split, mechanisms that operate so automatically you might not even recognize them. Jung observed that the double life develops through what he described as psychological fragmentation in relationships. You begin to operate in two distinct modes in every interaction, and over time, these modes become so separate that you lose track of which one is authentic. Jung identified a core mechanism in his clinical work. In intimate relationships, you develop two distinct ways of being. There's the perceiving self, who sees your partner's psychology clearly, understands their unconscious motivations, and can predict their behavioral patterns. Then there's the performing self, who pretends to discover things slowly, acts surprised by developments you saw coming, and carefully times insights to appear as natural observations rather than instant knowing. This creates profound intimacy barriers. You find yourself editing your responses to appear less knowing than you are. You pretend to gradually realize things you understood immediately. You ask questions you already know the answers to. You act surprised by behavior you predicted weeks earlier. You carefully time when to reveal insights to avoid seeming too much. Jung observed that this creates what he documented as barriers to authentic intimacy. Your partner falls in love with the performing self, the version that discovers things at normal speed, has normal reactions, needs normal amounts of information. But your perceiving self, the one doing the actual relationship work, remains hidden and unknown. This creates profound loneliness, even within intimate partnerships. Jung also documented how this splitting manifests in professional settings. He noted that intuitive introverts are naturally drawn to professions that utilize their psychological perception abilities: healthcare, counseling, teaching, management. But these same professions often have cultures that pathologize or dismiss intuitive ways of knowing. This creates what Jung observed as excessive professional persona development. In healthcare settings, you sense a patient's emotional state immediately, but frame it as clinical observation. You predict complications before symptoms appear, but present it as experience-based concern. You know family dynamics instantly, but document them as observed interactions. You feel the energy of dying patients, but discuss it only in medical terminology. Jung documented that this creates exhaustion not from the work itself, but from the constant cognitive load of translating intuitive insights into professionally acceptable language. You develop elaborate rationales for decisions that were actually based on immediate psychological perception. Perhaps most revealing were Jung's observations about unconscious physical strategies. Because your inferior sensation function makes you hypersensitive to environmental stimuli, you develop specific physical strategies to manage psychological overwhelm. Jung observed patients avoiding eye contact because they experienced direct psychological transmission through visual connection. Eye contact creates a direct channel for unconscious psychological material. Patients would wear hats or sunglasses, creating physical barriers that the psyche interprets as energetic protection. They choose seats with backs to walls, controlling psychological exposure. Jung also identified confusion between your own emotional content and absorbed material from others. When you suppress your natural psychological boundaries to fit social expectations, you lose the ability to distinguish between your own psychological content and others' emotional material. You walk into a room and immediately feel depressed without knowing why. You experience anxiety that clearly belongs to someone else. You take on others' emotional states without realizing it. In Jung's model, healthy introverted intuition operates with what he called permeable but conscious boundaries. You can sense others' psychological states without absorbing them because you maintain awareness of the difference between self and other. But when you're forced to suppress this function or hide your perceptions, Jung observed that the boundaries become either too rigid or too permeable. Jung documented the most psychologically damaging aspect: the constant cognitive load of functional suppression. Every interaction requires multiple layers of processing. You immediately understand the psychological dynamics, then assess whether sharing your perception is safe, then deliver a carefully edited version while monitoring reactions and adjusting in real time, all while managing your own frustration and any emotional content you've absorbed. Jung compared this to forcing a naturally left-handed person to write with their right hand all day. The mental energy required is enormous because you're working against your psychological brain. Over time, you develop protective linguistic patterns. Instead of saying, "I can see this relationship is going to end badly," you learn to say, "I have some concerns about the dynamics here." Instead of, "Your mother is manipulating you through guilt," you say, What do you think about your interaction patterns with your mom? Jung observed that this constant linguistic editing creates fragmentation of authenticity. You begin to lose touch with your natural voice because you're always translating it into something more palatable. Patients would tell Jung they couldn't remember how to just say what they see anymore. Everything came out filtered. Jung also noted that intuitive introverts develop artificial expressions of uncertainty, expressing doubt about perceptions they're actually certain about. I might be wrong, but when you know you're not. This is probably nothing, but when you know it's significant. Maybe I'm overthinking this. When your insight is accurate. Jung observed that this serves two functions: social protection and ego protection. If you're wrong, you've already acknowledged uncertainty. If others reject your insight, you can tell yourself you weren't really committed to it. But Jung warned that this creates anxiety about your own perceptions. You begin to doubt your own abilities because you've trained yourself to express them as uncertain. Jung was explicit about what this psychological splitting costs you over time. His clinical observations revealed specific patterns of deterioration that he documented across decades of practice. The first cost Jung identified was fragmentation of identity. When you constantly perform a version of yourself that's inauthentic, what Jung termed the ego-self relationship becomes disrupted. You begin to lose touch with which thoughts, feelings, and perceptions are genuinely yours versus which ones are adapted for others. In his notes, Jung documented patients saying things like, "I don't know what I actually think anymore. I can't tell if I'm upset or if I picked it up from someone else. And I've been performing normal for so long, I forgot what my real reactions are." Jung described a fundamental paradox. The more successfully you adapt to social expectations, the more you lose contact with your authentic psychological core. This creates what Jung termed displacement from your essential self, feeling like a stranger in your own life. Jung observed that the constant vigilance required to monitor and edit your responses creates what modern neuroscience would recognize as chronic stress response activation. He documented specific symptoms in his clinical practice: chronic fatigue that rest doesn't resolve, unexplained headaches and body aches, digestive issues and sleep disturbances, hypersensitivity to lights, sounds, and crowds. Jung understood this through his compensation theory. Your inferior sensation function becomes hyperactive and dysregulated when your dominant intuitive function is suppressed. The psyche is trying to ground itself through the body, but it's doing so in chaotic, uncontrolled ways. Jung observed that patients' bodies were essentially rebelling against the psychological splitting, demanding attention through symptoms. Jung documented a fundamental contradiction in his intuitive introvert patients. The better they became at social adaptation, the lonelier they felt in their relationships. This happens because people fall in love with your adapted persona, not your authentic self. Jung documented cases where patients felt completely unknown by their spouses, even in marriages spanning decades. Partners who love the version of you that needs explanations for things you already know. Family members who want your guidance, but get uncomfortable when you're too accurate. Jung noted that many intuitive introverts become so skilled at adaptation that they lose the ability to recognize when someone could handle their authenticity. They assume everyone needs the adapted version, missing opportunities for genuine connection. Jung observed that intuitive introverts who remain in the splitting pattern often experience what he called arrest of creative development. Their natural gifts remain underdeveloped because they're never fully expressed. Your career may plateau not because you lack ability, but because you're working from your adapted skills rather than your natural strengths. Jung documented cases of therapists who were brilliant but couldn't explain their methods, teachers who could transform students but worked within rigid curricula, managers who could predict organizational dynamics but waited for data to act. Jung noted that many of his intuitive introvert patients lived with a persistent sense that they were meant for something more, but couldn't identify what that was. This was often because their true gifts had been so deeply buried under adaptive personas that they'd lost touch with them. Jung warned that without conscious intervention, these costs compound exponentially. The splitting becomes more elaborate, the adapted persona becomes more rigid, and the authentic self becomes more buried. He observed patients who had developed such complex adaptive systems that they couldn't access their genuine responses, even in therapy. Jung documented that many intuitive introverts eventually reach what he called a compensation crisis, a point where the unconscious can no longer maintain the split. This often manifests as depression, anxiety, mysterious physical symptoms, or what Jung termed a crisis of meaning, a profound sense that life has become empty despite external success. Jung noted that this crisis, while painful, often becomes the catalyst for integration. The psyche essentially forces a reckoning between the authentic and adapted selves. Patients would come to him saying things like, "I don't know who I am anymore," or "I feel like I'm living someone else's life." But Jung also documented something remarkable. Patients who successfully navigated this crisis and learned to integrate their split selves didn't just return to their previous functioning. They achieved levels of psychological integration and effectiveness that exceeded anything they'd experienced before the splitting began. The remarkable news is that Jung didn't just identify the problem, he developed specific integration methods based on decades of clinical work with intuitive introverts who successfully bridged their two worlds. Jung observed that healing begins with what he called conscious recognition, becoming explicitly aware of your splitting patterns rather than operating them unconsciously. As Jung noted, the goal is to make unconscious patterns conscious so you can choose rather than be chosen by them. The first phase Jung documented was developing awareness of the split itself. This means recognizing the specific moments when you edit or suppress your perceptions, when you perform uncertainty about things you know, when you absorb others' emotional content, and when you provide adapted responses rather than authentic ones. Jung had patients track these patterns systematically, not to judge them, but to understand them. He observed that most intuitive introverts operate their splitting mechanisms so automatically that they don't realize how extensive the editing has become. The second phase Jung called conscious compensation. Instead of letting your inferior sensation function operate unconsciously through symptoms and compulsions, Jung advocated for deliberately developing your connection to physical reality. Jung was clear: you're not trying to become a sensation type. You're developing enough conscious relationship with sensation to support your intuitive function rather than having it sabotaged by unconscious compensation. Jung recommended deliberate grounding protocols, regular engagement with physical reality through structured activities that connect you to your body and the present moment. This might include gardening, cooking, crafts, or exercise that requires present moment focus. Jung observed that conscious sensation development helps intuitive introverts distinguish between physical environmental stimuli and psychological energy readings, between their own emotional states and absorbed emotional content, between intuitive perceptions and anxious projections. The third phase Jung documented was developing what he called conscious choice in sharing perceptions, choosing strategically when, how, and with whom to share your authentic perceptions. Jung observed that successful integration doesn't mean being completely authentic with everyone. Instead, it means making conscious choices rather than operating from automatic suppression or unconscious revelation. Jung documented that integrated patients develop different levels of authenticity for different relationships. They identify safe harbor relationships where they can exist without psychological editing. They develop professional frameworks that honor their abilities within acceptable contexts. They learn to adapt consciously rather than reactively. Jung observed that the deepest healing happens when intuitive introverts learn to build bridges between their perceptual world and others' more conventional ways of understanding. This involves developing translation skills. Instead of sharing insights as definitive statements, which can feel threatening to others. Jung taught patients to frame them as collaborative exploration. Instead of saying, "Your sister is manipulating you," learning to say, "I'm curious about something I'm noticing in your interactions with your sister. Would you be open to exploring it together?" Jung noted that intuitive introverts often achieve their greatest professional success when they learn to work with their natural abilities rather than despite them. This means finding ways to use your perceptual abilities effectively within existing professional frameworks. In healthcare settings, this might mean developing clinical language for energy observations. In educational contexts, framing student energy readings as learning style observations. In management roles, presenting team dynamic insights as organizational behavior analysis. Jung documented that mastered intuitive introverts develop conscious control of permeability, the ability to consciously control when and how much they absorb from others. This involves setting explicit intentions before challenging interpersonal situations, visualizing protective boundaries while maintaining openness to genuine perception, practicing observing without absorbing, and developing post-interaction cleansing protocols. Jung documented specific markers that indicate successful integration. Internally, this manifests as decreased exhaustion from constant self-monitoring, more spontaneous, authentic responses in appropriate situations, clearer distinction between your emotions and others, and increased confidence in your perceptions. Relationally, integration appears as having at least one relationship where you can be fully yourself. Decreased resentment about being misunderstood, better ability to identify people who can handle your authenticity, and more satisfying professional relationships. Professionally, integration manifests as using your natural abilities to enhance your work rather than hiding them, developing a reputation for good instincts and insight, less stress about professional performance, and career advancement based on authentic strengths. Jung believed that the ultimate goal isn't to eliminate the split between your inner perception and outer adaptation. It's to make the management of this split conscious and deliberate rather than unconscious and reactive. Jung's clinical work with intuitive introverts revealed a profound insight. The double life isn't a psychological flaw to be eliminated. It's a capacity that can be consciously mastered. The exhaustion you feel isn't a flaw in your psychological design. It's a signal that you're operating from unconscious compensation rather than conscious integration. Your sensitivity isn't the problem. The suppression of your sensitivity is what creates the exhaustion. Your perceptions aren't too intense. Your need to hide them is what creates the internal pressure. You don't need to become someone else. You need to become more consciously, skillfully yourself. The double life isn't something to eliminate, it's something to master. The goal is to become fluent in both worlds, the world of immediate perception and the world of gradual understanding. Jung observed in his clinical practice that successfully integrated intuitive introverts develop the ability to bridge different worlds of understanding, not by hiding their abilities, but by learning to share them in ways that others can receive and use. They become the people others seek out when something doesn't feel right, but they can't identify what. They become trusted advisors whose good instincts are valued, even if their methods aren't understood. They become the ones who can see what's coming and help others prepare without creating panic or resistance. Jung recognized that integrated intuitive introverts serve a crucial function in human development. They can perceive psychological patterns before they become obvious. They sense the health of relationships, organizations, and communities in ways that can guide healing and growth. But Jung's work also suggests that this capacity comes with responsibility. Your gift isn't just the ability to perceive, it's the potential to help others understand what they cannot see alone. This means learning to use your abilities in service rather than in hiding. When you stop pretending you don't see what you see and start learning how to share it skillfully, something remarkable happens. You stop feeling like an alien in your own life. You find your people, other integrated individuals who understand your experience. You discover your purpose, the unique way you're meant to translate unconscious wisdom for the world. Jung documented in his clinical work The patients who successfully navigated this integration didn't just return to their previous functioning. They achieved levels of psychological effectiveness, relational depth, and professional impact that exceeded anything they'd experienced before the splitting began. The world needs what you see, but it needs it delivered in ways that create connection rather than distance, trust rather than fear, hope rather than overwhelm. Your sensitivity is not a burden to be managed. It's a gift to be refined and shared. Jung's clinical observations suggest this. The suffering of the double life is not meaningless. It's the cost of unconscious compensation, and it can be transformed through conscious integration into your greatest strength and your most profound contribution to the world. The exhausting performance of pretending you're not sensitive can end. The loneliness of hiding your perceptions can be healed. The professional stagnation that comes from working against your nature can be transformed. But it requires a choice. The choice to stop adapting unconsciously and start integrating consciously. The choice to stop hiding your gifts and start refining them. The choice to stop living in the split and start building bridges between your two worlds. As Jung observed through his clinical work, when intuitive introverts learn to honor their perceptions while developing the skills to share them effectively, they don't just heal their own psychological splitting, they can become agents of healing for the splits in others, in relationships, in organizations, and in society itself. The goal isn't to choose between your two worlds, it's to become the conscious bridge between them. Stop pretending you don't see what you see. Start learning how to share it skillfully. The world is waiting for what only you can offer. Which stage of the double life are you living in right now? Are you in stage 1, just beginning to learn that your perceptions need to be hidden? Stage 2, exhausted from the constant performance of being normal? Or stage 3, ready to stop the splitting and start integrating consciously? Share your stage in the comments below, and what's been the most exhausting part of maintaining your adapted persona. Your story might be exactly what another intuitive introvert needs to hear to know they're not alone in this psychological journey. And if you haven't watched part 1, where we explore Jung's discovery of why intuitive introverts are the most difficult type, and the 3 dangerous psychological stages that can destroy your mental health, watch it next by clicking in this video.